Hello, everyone. My name is Zeyi Yang. I'm a senior writer at Wire covering Chinese technologies and companies. I'm very happy to be here. Do you want to do a self-introduction or do you think that's already covered?
Yeah, we thought we'd sort of, do as much Q&A as possible, but I don't want anyone to be totally lost as to what this book is about. And so maybe I'll give like a 5-minute introduction, but I get
Sure.
excited about my own topic. So if
I'll
Zayi needs
time
to
you.
shut me up, that's perfectly fine. It won't be rude. Already given him permission. In a sense, I was trying to, so I was a Financial Times reporter for Apple for 4 years, and I realized sort of in the final months of that role before going on book leave that there were 3 books on Apple that I really wanted to read, and the problem was none of them existed. One of them would be Apple going from near bankruptcy in 1996, before Steve Jobs comes back, to being the world's most valuable company by the time of Steve Jobs' death. You would think that book exists, but unless you're counting Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, a person rather than the sort of full history of the company, that doesn't exist. The second book would be, how does Apple actually make its products? And aside from the most superficial understanding of how they do them, I don't think that really exists, full on does not exist as a book. And then the third one is, how did Apple respond to a changing China, where Xi Jinping becomes the ruler in 2013, takes China in a pretty different direction. And to know anything about China is like, if you're gonna have a big Apple store in like prime real estate on a corner in Shanghai, it's not just that you found a good deal and paid the price. Like, you have to have political connections for that to take place. And that didn't seem to exist. And not only were there no books about this, there wasn't really a whole lot of reporting in terms of magazines or whatever. There's a few good reporters. I don't want to say there was nothing on this at all. But it strikes me that in the last 25 years, the only stories we were telling about Apple in China were to explain problems. So problems of allegations of Uyghur labor, problems of underage workers, or what am I trying to say? More hours than you're allowed to legally do. So China was always entering the picture to explain problems. And like, China's the secret sauce of how Apple operates and sells 230 million iPhones, let alone all their other products, per year. So why weren't we asking the questions of like, how does this partnership work, right? If this is a marriage, what is its success based on? And basically, we just weren't asking that question, let alone answering it. And the more that I began to talk to Apple people that worked there in the 90s and 2000s, I realized that I didn't just have contemporary questions. I had questions about, what did they quote unquote discover in China in the early 2000s? What did they see that Dell and HP didn't see? And then as I began to understand things like the candy-colored iMac that people might remember from 1998, like, that product is not made in China. It's made in Korea. It's also made in Wales. It's made in Mexicali. It's made in the Czech Republic. It's made in Ireland. It's made in Singapore. There's this big experimentation stage where Apple's sort of like looking around the world for how it can build its products. And nobody had really covered that either. And then they consolidate into China later on. The other thing was like, how cognizant was Steve Jobs about all of this? It turns out that he really wasn't on board with outsourcing and offshoring in general, but it was out of complete financial desperation that they had to have somebody else build their products. And then Tim Cook, who's now the CEO, really convinces Steve Jobs that like, this is what we have to do. And then like, the sort of biggest contribution the book makes to Apple history is essentially makes the argument, maybe it's not really even an argument, it's just a demonstration from all the sourcing, that when Apple moves to China in the early 2000s, it's not lured by a whole bunch of tech competence that's already existing in the country and can therefore fulfill Apple orders. It's other things. It's industrial policy. It's an ability to scale. It's hundreds of millions of migrant laborers that are sort of accessible to factories to build in a sort of proprietary sense. And Apple realizes they can build the tech competence that they need. And so they end up sending over what eventually is plane loads of Apple engineers to hundreds of factories across the country to basically get up to the spec, get up to what Apple demands in terms of quality, and then to ramp up the scale into enormous quantities. And so the amount of labor in any given year taking place in China is 3 million people making Apple products. And the churn in these factories is extraordinary. So maybe I'll just cut it off there, but that would be sort of like the basic crux of what we're talking about tonight.
That's basically the whole book. You don't have to read the book anymore. That's actually also a very good segue to my first question,
Great.
which is that you've wrote in the book that throughout Apple's history of outsourcing to different countries and then ended up in China, it has been very hands-on about the manufacturing. It's flying engineers to China, to Singapore, Korea, to train the workers, to tell them how to manufacture an Apple device and kind of push the boundary of cutting-edge technologies in manufacturing. Can you talk about how that's different from the other tech companies and what they're doing at the time?
Yeah, so Apple is actually late to going to China, but in the same way that they're late to MP3 players, but they dominate with the iPod, they're late to smartphones, but they dominate with the iPhone. That's sort of the supply chain story writ large. I mean, there are companies like HP that have a presence in China going back to the mid-1980s, and Apple's not really building there until the first year of the 21st century. So it's not a novel idea to go make things in Asia, certainly not, and definitely not in China. But Apple has this like pyramid structure within the company that becomes pretty fundamental to how it operates. So I'll try not to go through the whole pyramid here, but essentially the tip of the pyramid is how do we conceive of products? And this is Johnny Ive sort of interacting with the industrial design team and Steve Jobs. So if you ever wondered, like, why is the iPod sort of like unapologetically white with a chrome back? Like, that's Johnny Ive. But then he throws it over the fence to a team called PD, Product Design. They're the ones that have to sort of create one of what has come out of Johnny Ive's imagination. So, what circuit board is required, what battery is required, so forth. How can we make one of these things, right? And then the third element of the pyramid is the team that sort of like, without them, I wouldn't have written a book. This is what got me really excited about the topic. They're called MD, or manufacturing design. And their job is to go find the factories that are going to be able to sort of like meet Apple's demands in terms of quality and then later in terms of quantity. So, just to give one of my favorite anecdotes in the book, United Airlines in 2014 and 2016 is literally convinced by Apple to begin flying to two different cities, Chengdu and Hangzhou, cities that United had never been to before, and to fly there 3 times a week because Apple says, we will purchase enough first-class seats 3 times a week to these cities that even if the rest of the plane is empty, you will still make money. So add airlines to the list of industries that Apple has disrupted. So nobody else is doing anything like this. And the reason why, I like to joke that, like, what's your favorite Dell computer from the early 2000s? What's your favorite HP computer from late 1999? I mean, the room is just silent because nobody remembers any of these products. They were boring as hell. It wasn't what they were trying to do. Those PC companies did well because they could do logistics and distribution and just-in-time manufacturing in proficient ways, but design aesthetics was not part of their thing. When Apple introduces the iMac, they set the subs off on such a different course where if you understand the design to be conceptually completely different from any other computer you could buy at the time, we in the journalist world have just sort of failed to understand that if the design is different, the manufacturing is different. And so to get the manufacturing right, Apple has to send people over to train everybody. Because if you're Foxconn and you've been building beige boxes, that gives you like almost zero of the skill sets to do a translucent plastic computer more in the shape of an egg than a box. So there's really nobody else. And I mean, the book has been out for months. I've spoken to people from Dell, Motorola, HP, Palm Pilot, all sorts of companies, and none of them were asking of their suppliers what Apple was asking.
And you were saying that if you were a tech company, they are paying so much attention to details of your product, then you would inevitably end up in China. Is that right?
Wait, one more time?
Are you saying that, like, right now you're talking about Apple is the company that stands out in how much attention it pays to the details and how many engineers they send to China at a time to kind of focus on the quality of the products? Is that why they choose China? Is China the only place they could put that off at a time?
Yeah, so some of the early chapters, or I'll give you some behind the scenes moment here. The first like 95 pages barely mention China. I mean, sort of the prologue. And when I submitted the manuscript, I sort of just was in my own little rabbit hole for like a year writing this book. And then I just submitted the entire thing to my publisher. And my biggest fear was that my publisher would call me up and be like, where's China? Like, I'm 100 pages into this book and we're in Korea right now. Like, what's going on? This is a book called Apple in China. Like, we need to, like get rid of this. And that was my biggest fear. So thankfully, they never said anything like that. They sort of got it. But the reason is that from 1996 to 2003, Apple is in all these different countries, but as they begin to have success, especially with the iPod mini, but also the iMac G4. I should really have some images for this. The iMac G4 is this computer that looked like a sunflower. It sort of floats towards you. It actually is a little bit anthropomorphic, and the first commercial was it like looking like it was about to break dance, like it's nodding to the beat and stuff. It's like a remarkable computer. And it was built in Taiwan by a company called Quanta. And the trouble is like Quanta just couldn't get enough employees on the production line. They literally had to import people from the Philippines just to sort of man the line. And then you had things like metal stamping was done in Japan, the wiring was done in mainland China. They relied on like a Singapore Airlines-based blade fabrication place, fabricator, I guess, in Singapore. I mean, so basically the value of China in these early years of the 21st century was to replicate or sort of lure in the supply chain that was fragmented and scattered, mostly across Asia, Southeast Asia, but leading all the way up to Japan, and basically say, we're going to have next door manufacturing facilities where instead of having to fly across a body of water to sort of work on a new prototype, you'd like walk up the block. And so China just offered like the scale, let alone the low labor costs, in a way that really nobody could compete with. But one thing that's maybe worth noting, Apple isn't really the entity, and Tim Cook really isn't the guy who made that decision. The suppliers themselves were making those decisions. They were the ones waking up to the opportunity of what was possible in China. And Tim Cook and Apple just sort of rode that wave better than anybody else.
I was going to ask you, because between Apple and the Chinese suppliers or Taiwanese suppliers like Foxconn and the Chinese government, there's three entities who are working very close with each other to kind of result in the reality we have today that Apple is just so embedded in China. Which of the three has contributed most to the reality today? Can you assign a percentage to each of them to say?
So I like to joke that Apple and China are married. And so I often talk about their meet cute moment when it wasn't really the Apple that we think about today. It was a struggling company that was nearly bankrupt in 96, 97, and again in 2000. And it wasn't really China on the other end, because it was basically in Shenzhen. And Shenzhen, I probably don't have to tell this crowd, was basically like this capitalist experimentation zone that wasn't really sort of like, like at best the policy of Beijing was sort of just like let things rip and turn a blind eye to it. So they didn't necessarily understand what was going on. And in fact, it sort of like leads up to what happens in 2013 when Xi Jinping quite suddenly really does want to know what's going on. So anyway, so the marriage reference, I'm bringing that up because it's like sort of saying who's more important in your marriage, the husband or the wife? Like that's a contentious question to answer. And so I don't know that I could do it for Apple and China. But I would say that I try to give enormous credit to Foxconn. I think Apple, in a sense, exploits the hell out of them. But Foxconn is instrumental to the narrative. And maybe, just in case, I just want to make sure we're sort of all on the same page here because I haven't mentioned this. Foxconn is Taiwanese. And that's incredibly important to understand because when China is really coming out of the Mao era. I mean, they don't have the skills to manufacture things. And so the reason Shenzhen becomes this experimentation zone is to basically lure in capital from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Japan, and hopefully the skill sets as well, to sort of teach the Chinese like how to do apparel, how to do textiles, and all this sort of thing. And electronics, as you can guess, would be a little bit later. And then, by the late 1990s, Foxconn is pretty influential, but they're not the Foxconn that we think of as today. That happens pretty quickly in the 2000s, but they're not particularly special in the late 1990s. And for me, Foxconn and founder Terry Guo is particularly important because what he understands is that the other Taiwanese don't really want to work with Apple. And it's understandable why they wouldn't want to work with Apple. Apple is absolutely ruthless when it comes to the negotiations. And this is when they're like little, right? I mean, let alone now. But they're little and they're ruthless about, caring about every penny in the supply chain. And then they send their engineers over. And I've been portraying this as a positive thing, but this wasn't considered a positive thing if you were a Taiwanese supplier, because they have these engineers who are like breathing down your neck to making sure everything that is up and running. And so companies like Quanta actually didn't want to work with Apple. But Terry Guo understands, and I'm sorry that this sounds a little bit like a cliche thing that you would have in a high school, the challenge is the opportunity, right? Right? Da-da-da-da. So basically Terry Guo's understanding is like, if we can please Apple, we can please anybody. Because if you have a whole crew of people that are supplying Apple with the plastic injection molding required for the candy-colored iMac, Dell is going to be a field day. And so he actually sort of plays against this in some respect. So I have this great anecdote from Tony Fadell, who people might remember as the Podfather, former senior vice president at Apple. And he says, sometimes after working with a bunch of Foxconn engineers for 12 weeks, we would come into work one day and find that we don't recognize a single person on the production line, right? Or in the factory. And it's because Foxconn had basically taken the engineers and put them on a production line where they're actually going to make money for Dell. And so it was like a new semester at Apple University had started, and these engineers for Apple would have to train a whole new cohort of people.
And I think that's where it comes in, where one of the biggest contributions Apple has made to China is basically training the workers, training the factories into how to make world-class electronics,
yes.
Which at the time China does not know how to do it, right?
Yeah. Because sometimes in social media clips of mine, this has been sort of taken the wrong way, as if I'm not crediting China. And the funny thing is, I'm trying to credit the hell out of China. My whole point is that Apple can't do this anywhere else. Only China is capable of providing this, and not just because of the population, but because of their hardworkingness, because of their industrial policy, because of their ability to scale. And so Apple is just a company that recognizes this more than anybody else. And in the earliest years, it really is through Terry Go's sophistication. And one thing people don't understand is Apple is outsourcing production to Terry Guo. They're also outsourcing the politicking to Terry Guo. Terry is brilliant at understanding that there's something different about Chinese communism as it's emerging after around 1993 versus Soviet communism. Soviet communism is very top-down. Chinese communism, I'm hesitating to say this in front of a scholar like Orville Schell, but it's almost grassroots, right? So there might be a very top-down 5-year plan, but to enact the plan, local cadres in various jurisdictions are wanting to sort of bend over backwards, do whatever they want to do so that they can lure in the capital and basically show that their region is achieving to that plan better than anybody else, right? And so in the West, if you're a businessman and you're talking to a bureaucrat, the bureaucrat is probably somebody that is like putting things in your way, environmental standards or any number of things, right? A bureaucrat in the Chinese system is actually someone that's more like a venture capitalist that sits on your board and promotes growth. Right? And so Terry understands that. And so he's actually sort of working with the local governments to get the quid pro quos so that like we can lure in the Apple orders, but we're going to sort of give all sorts of jobs to your community. So you, local cadre, you need to provide me with free land, subsidized machinery, and any number of things to sort of help me get done what I need to do. And the sort of caveat is you better deliver on your orders. And what Terry understands is if I bet on Apple, I'm always going to deliver on my orders.
And then I think one of the most important moments that you wrote in the book is when Apple realized that it could not just rely on Foxconn to do all the government relations stuff, because it became the start of the show and it became the prime target for the Chinese government to kind of to rule, right? Can you talk about the moment when like Xi Jinping came on stage and started like kind of putting pressure on Apple?
Yeah, so within 36 hours of Xi Jinping coming to power in March 2013, Apple is attacked by CCTV. This is actually a news story worldwide, but I don't think we as journalists ever really realized why Apple was being attacked. Ostensibly, they are being attacked for warranty differences. The allegation by CCTV, and they actually had sort of like secret footage in places like Paris and then comparing it to Beijing, was that the Chinese warranty policy on behalf of Apple was different, and it was treating the Chinese in an inferior way. And the most exciting thing I did in the book was solve the riddle of what the hell was going on here. And I'll try to give a succinct answer, but I get excited about this narrative because it's part 4 of the book. This is literally 5 chapters. It's my favorite part of the book. And it seems like a real diversion because most of the book is about supply chain, manufacturing, technology transfer, and this is all about retail sales. So the most basic version I can tell you is that Apple in 2008 has no faith that anyone in China is going to buy the iPhone. If you remember, Steve Ballmer thought no one was going to buy the iPhone in America because it was $600. And so you can think that, well, why would anyone in China be buying it? Basically, there's not enough people with enough income to afford it. Instead, it becomes a wild success. So the first Apple store in Sanlitun, Beijing, is opened only because the Beijing Olympics are happening in 2008. And the sense is this is going to lose money for years, but it's a great marketing opportunity. Let's do it. By 2010, there are 4 Apple stores in the country, and the iPhone 4, I think, becomes the most conspicuous product that everybody in China wants to have. And it's hard to overstate what the demand is. Some of these examples are tragic. There's a 17-year-old who undergoes black market surgery to sell a kidney in exchange for an iPod, or an iPhone and an iPad. There are thousands of people taking out loans, 45% interest rates, in order to acquire Apple products. And Apple is totally taken aback and flummoxed by this demand. One of my favorite examples is they begin surveying people as they leave the store as to like their basic income and things like that. And they find a mailman who had spent 30% of his annual salary to buy an iPhone. And so they say, like, why would you do that? Kind of funny thing to say. And he says, when people see me with the iPhone, I'm not a mailman. It's hard to overstate how much people wanted to have the phone. It was a way of showing I've made it. I can think for myself, all sorts of things. And I'm trying to keep this succinct, but again, it's really exciting. So anyway, so this cohort of people known in China as the yellow cows, they're scalpers, but they have this history going back to 1990 where they understand market dynamics and inefficiencies, and then they exploit them. So the example I cite in the book is that in the early 1990s, traveling by rail becomes popular in China, but the government wasn't all that quick in developing enough rail car capacity. And so the yellow cows figure this out. They buy up all the rail car tickets, and then they just stand beside the official booth and they sell the prices at sell the tickets at inflated prices. But interesting for our narrative is then they get greedy and they start working with factories to forge the tickets and then sell those. And that's a little foreshadowing of what happens with the iPhone. So in 2010, 4 stores for 1.4 billion people. That would be the equivalent of there being 1 Apple store in all of America, and we all want to buy the iPhone, right? So just think of the chaos that would ensue. But there ends up being 5, 6, 7,000 people snaking around the store, or each of these 4 stores. And what's interesting about them is the image that you would have would be if you saw some like relatively impoverished people outside of Tiffany's and like by the thousands, and you'd be like, what's going on here? And it's because the yellow cows are hiring migrants from rural areas to come in because there's a limit to purchase 2 phones per person. And so each of these migrants is buying 2 phones, getting paid a small fee. And then like an entire bus is going to a city like Chongqing, population 32 million, number of Apple stores 0. And they're hawking the phones at like double the retail price. So that's good enough. But then they find ways of hollowing out the components and then resealing the box. So they're actually selling the memory into markets in Shenzhen and so forth. And then to go even further, they're buying phones outside of China where there's no value-added tax, places like Hong Kong, places like Oregon, and then smuggling them in. And some of the stories of smuggling are insane. And then to take things even further, they realize that, wait a minute, if we buy phones at T-Mobile in the US on a 24-month contract using a fake ID, we can pay for an iPhone at 1 month of the 24-month contract. So in other words, you can acquire an iPhone at less than $100, and you can still go to Chongqing after hollowing out the components and sell it for $800 or $900. So to put this succinctly, the yellow cows figure out of making more money per iPhone than Apple. Okay? And these are the years in which Apple is becoming the most valuable company on the planet because of how successful the iPhone is. Okay, on top of that, again, this is 4 or 5 chapters. There are fake Apple stores all across the country. Apple actually at one point commissioned a study, and the number that came back was so outlandish that they just rejected it. It was 16,000. That was the number of fake stores in Apple, according to this study. I don't know what to do with that. Apple didn't know what to do with that, but that's what this third party said. The problem with these stores is that not only did you, going to the store, not know that it was a fake Apple store, the employee with their blue shirt with a big Apple logo there also thought it was a real store, okay? But then if I broke the phone or I had a faulty phone because it had been tampered with and I went back to the store, I'm obviously not getting Apple's courteous service, right? And so in addition, well, no, I'm skipping ahead. So, okay, so one thing happens. Oh God, I haven't even brought up, this is such a long answer, but again, it's just my favorite part of the book. Okay, in addition to selling the phones made by T-Mobile, or some of you, if you're tech savvy, might realize, wait a minute, you can't just get a phone in T-Mobile in Portland and then have it run in China. It doesn't work like that. True. Not a fault in the story. They were using their factory connections to literally zap out the processor, okay? So they'd render the phone inoperable, but by doing so, they're also masking the retail origin of where the phone came from. And aside from some, computer digits or whatever inside, the phones are identical. So the lines that had been snake lining outside of the Sanlitun store, let's say, go to the other side of the store, the Genius Bar, the return side. And I talked to someone at Apple who said, you would have people coming up with an entire backpack full of phones and saying, I bought these for my whole village, but none of them work. I need replacements. And the Genius Bar in Beijing is now looking at them and being like, I don't know what's going on here. I can confirm these are all new phones, but they don't work. Here is, 15 new phones. We are so sorry, right? Apple thinks it has a supply chain problem. It doesn't realize they're being scammed. Okay, so eventually Apple catches wind that there's something amiss here, and they begin holding on to the phones for 30 days. They begin using sophisticated machinery to look at a near atomic level of what's going on to figure out which phones have been tampered with, which haven't been, and so forth. This is longer than my intro, by the way. And then hopefully you can understand why. And so in addition to that, so once Apple realizes there's something going on here, they institute these policies, and there's this cat and mouse game between Apple. And this is the origin, sort of hitherto unsolved, of why there was a warranty difference, right? This is the thing that CCTV attacked Apple for. They were treating the Chinese in a different way, but it's because they were being scammed and they were trying to figure out what was going on. They were giving refurbished phones rather than brand new ones because they were beginning to understand that there's this lucrative gray market where people are literally making like hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, so then CCTV, sort of the state-sponsored CNN of China, goes after Apple. And Apple, in a sense, doesn't know enough about China to even be worried or fearful. They're kind of flummoxed. And they basically deny that there's a warranty difference. The thing I'm talking about wouldn't be well known within Apple. And they issued this benign apology, or not an apology, a benign explanation. And there's what I call a digital blitzkrieg for 3 weeks, where social media, whole bunch of papers, including the People's Daily, sort of attacks Apple for its incomparable arrogance. And Apple begins to be really fearful about its business. Sales, I think in the prior December quarter, had gone up almost 70%. And then they begin to freeze and then actually fall during this 3-week period. And Apple begins to be worried that we're the next Google, we're the next Facebook, i.e. Banned in the country. So this is the origin of Xi Jinping sort of going after them through CCTV. And Apple has a real wake-up call and realizes, like, we don't understand this country, we don't understand the culture. We're the biggest operator in the country, we're the biggest retail sales company, and yet we're we're missing something here. We don't know what to do.
And I feel like the other big picture factor that goes into that is Apple, unlike a lot of the auto companies or other foreign companies coming to China, has never formed a joint venture with any Chinese company.
Yes.
So the more successful Apple becomes in China, the more likely you will be seen as this outsider who comes into our country, comes to our market, takes up all the profit, and then leaves. And it does not contribute to actually the building of the nation, right?
Yes.
And then that's what I find very interesting, is that because Apple's response to all of this political fiasco is to change its marketing tactics, to repackage what it has already been doing in China, which is investing in all of these factories, investing in equipment and training, and say that actually, look at what we've been doing. We have been investing billions of dollars into the country. You just didn't know about that, right?
Yes. Yes, so what we talked about earlier, where Apple was sending in their engineers, they're totally operating under the radar. And again, for the first years, they were really just in Shenzhen. So like nobody really knew what they were up to. So my sort of thought experiment is that if you were Xi Jinping's lawyer in March 2013 and you were told to build the case against Apple, the evidence would be everywhere because the companies that are working for Apple aren't really being paid. Sometimes they're losing money. And Foxconn is like, the archetypal example of like a great partnership, and they're earning like 2.5% margins. And the astonishing thing about Apple and Foxconn is in the first 4 years of their partnership, Foxconn actually earned more money in absolute dollars, and they earned more margin. And then the iPod mini, followed by the iPhone, go wild. And Apple margins literally go from 1% to 26%, okay? And Foxconn margins fall from above 10% to 2.5%. So Apple is squeezing the hell out of its supplier. And that's its best supplier, like its best known supplier. You can imagine that the other suppliers are being squeezed even further. Now again, Terry understands this. I mean, Terry was upset. Terry had meetings all the time with Tim Cook trying to sort of get this changed, to be clear. He's not happy about this. But he understands that the value of working with Apple is the learning, not the profits. Other Chinese companies, they're Taiwanese, companies in China don't understand that. And actually, a lot of companies in China in the 2000s do not want to work with Apple because they're seen as overbearing and they don't understand the technology transfer that's involved. So when Xi Jinping comes in, he's emphasizing in China for China. I think you can rightfully call that the equivalent of America First. And he's emphasizing what he calls Made in China 2025, an ambitious plan in 2015 for basically for China to sever itself from the West. And what this team within Apple, the first senior people living in the country that jokingly call themselves the Gang of Eight, they realize, hold for laughter, they realize that we don't have any joint ventures in the country, and that's why Apple's upset. But if we weren't so secretive, Beijing would understand that we are doing phenomenal things for the country. Because you have to understand, the iPhone is built in a way that Nokia phones are not. I mean, to quote Jon Stewart, the shit's beautiful, right? I mean, it's just made really, really well. And the tolerances that you have to achieve require all sorts of training and investment. And if I'm skipping ahead a little bit here, the number that Apple released in February for how many people they've trained in their supply chain since 2008 is 30 million. Greater than the labor force of Canada or California. So the training that's taking place is monumental. And the problem in 2013, 2014, 2015 is Beijing doesn't know this because Apple's not advertising it. And so they basically flip the narrative on its head and they basically say, it's true that Samsung has 35 joint ventures in the country and we have 0, but you don't understand our business model. We are training the hell out of hundreds of factories to get up to our level of quality, and then we're helping them scale to world-leading volumes.
And Beijing responded super well to that.
So well that one of the chief beneficiaries of this meeting, so basically Tim Cook goes to Zhongnanhai, citadel of communist power, with Lisa Jackson and Jeff Williams, two other senior bigwigs at Apple, and they basically explain this to Apple, to China. And the other figure, aside from the 30 million people trained, is that Apple, the Gang of Eight, had done this supply chain study where they realized they were investing $55 billion a year into Chinese factories. This number does not include the bill of materials, so I'm not counting the value of the chips or the aluminum or anything like that. This is purely the construction costs of Apple stores. That's a small figure. The machinery that it places on other people's production lines, that sometimes is huge. So like the MacBook in 2008, the one that could fit into a little envelope, the MacBook Air. That was built in a process that required CNC machines. They cost upwards of $1 million each. Apple bought 10,000 of them and put them in Chinese factories. Only bought 10,000 because they couldn't buy more. They had to secure the supply chain, basically corner the market on CNC machines for years. But of course, they weren't building anything themselves. This is all for their Chinese factories. So they're building up just world-leading capacity. I've totally lost the thread of what I was going on about.
The 55 billion.
Oh, the 55 billion. Oh, yeah. So the machinery, and then the third thing is the labor costs, right? So the 3 million people that they have in their supply chain, some of them are only working for Apple for 8, 12, 16 weeks, to be clear. But they're counting the wages of those people as training costs, which calculates as something called registered capital within China. Anyway, and so Beijing is so convinced by this that just a year and a half or so later, Tesla comes calling, Elon Musk saying, I'm thinking about building a factory in Shanghai. We think we could do it in 24 months. And the mayor of Shanghai says, make it 12. And they basically give them subsidized land, machinery, and so forth. And Tesla copies the Apple model. I mean, they're basically told, do for EVs what Apple has done for smartphones. And so Tesla's a little bit different. Obviously, they do manufacture themselves, but they have to rely on a supply network. And so they localize the supply chain by copying the Apple model. They literally hire people from Apple that have China experience to basically train up all the suppliers to get to Tesla's level. So all the things that Apple had done over the previous 10, 15 years were basically replicated by Tesla. And by 2023, I think it is, Joe Biden is slapping 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. So I'm simplifying a little bit here, but I think it's hard to denigrate or understate what Tesla's impact was on EVs in terms of how they were built, but also sort of the allure of them.
Also, one of the small anecdotes I want to add is that Apple also personally contributed to the rise of BYD because when it was still trying to make a car, it actually worked with BYD in working on better batteries, and that BYD now becomes like the most powerful battery company in the world. I mean, maybe also rivaling with Cato. But I want to come back to the name, the Game of Eight, because I've been dying to ask you: is that a wordplay of the Game of Four from Cultural Revolution?
So that's one reference, but the more I read Chinese history, the more I come across other gangs.
Okay.
So
Just to clarify, these are like 8 senior executives in charge of Apple's operations in China, right?
Operations is one person.
Okay.
Procurement, Apple University, research and development, retail sales, third-party marketing. So yeah, the gamut.
So they were calling themselves the Game of Eight.
Correct.
Oh wow, that's interesting.
It was fun calling members that didn't know that I knew the term and then using it with them. But
how did you know that? Okay, so we're gonna open the floor to questions in about
please.
5 minutes. But before that, I want to bring us to the current day. One of the biggest questions coming out of this book is that where does Apple go from now? And one specific question I want to ask is that, as we've seen the first 90 pages of the book, Apple has made a lot of pivots away from Singapore, away from Korea, and finding itself eventually in China. Why can't Apple just pivot itself away from China again? What's the obstacles there?
So, yeah, the argument is essentially that Apple has just invested so much in China and not really anywhere else in the same degree that no other country exists that has the same capabilities, the same tech competence, right? So when I talked about 25 years ago, made in China was synonymous with poorly made. Nobody would make that argument now. I mean, China's superiority in advanced manufacturing is so hard to fathom that experts in the field struggle to really comprehend it. And you have to do so in weird ISO documentations and stuff. I mean, I would just say China installed more industrial robots on its production lines last year than the rest of the world combined. So if you want to know, why don't they move to India? It's because India has an order of magnitude less machinery, less robots, and they also don't have the years of experience that the Chinese have. So India comes up a lot because it's the only country on the planet that, at least at a superficial level, resembles China, or at least resembles China from 25 years ago. In other words, the labor rates are significantly lower. It's got a country of 1.5 billion. Unfortunately, I think the differences between India and China are far more profound than the rather superficial similarities. So, Apple is trying to diversify to India, and it's very possible that someone in this room will purchase an iPhone next year and it'll say it's made in India, but it's not really made in India. It's made in India insofar as tariff law is concerned, but if it takes 1,000 steps to build an iPhone and the final step is done in India, for tariff law, that's a substantive change to the product and it can be considered made in India, but it's no less dependent on the China-centric supply chain than anything else. And then the other thing is the more successful Apple is in expanding to India, the more it'll face 3 major problems. One is that Beijing can just tighten the screws, right? So electricity at random factories just goes out on a random Wednesday, and Apple engineers are stuck wondering, is that because of that press release about India that Tim Cook just made, or is that something else? And there doesn't have to be anything explicit on the part of Beijing or Shenzhen. Apple is just in a position to now understand how Chinese politics work a little bit, that they would fall in line pretty quick. And actually, since the book was been published, there have been multiple stories in several different outlets that Foxconn workers that are Chinese that are setting up production lines in China and India are being recalled. Machinery bound for Tata production lines, if the customs understands that this is for iPhone production lines in Karnataka, it's being blocked, and so forth. So that problem 1. Problem 2 is the Chinese rightfully see the iPhone as an indigenous product. This shouldn't be a major claim. I used to live in Germany, and I asked my taxi driver why he drove a Ford. And he said, well, Ford's been in Germany for seven decades or what have you. This is a German vehicle as much as a Mercedes is. That's how the Chinese view the iPhone, I think appropriately so. The more that Apple becomes synonymous with, or the poster child, let's say, for diversifying or de-risking or decoupling from China, the more it puts its $70 billion business in China at risk. The third is that as much as Apple can replicate the playbook and train up a whole bunch of Indian engineers, it can't build the 8-lane highways, it can't build the world-leading ports, and it can't be the high-speed rail. So unless India begins knocking it out of the park on those 3 fronts, and there's a whole bunch of others, those are sort of arbitrarily chosen, India's just not going to be the perfect partner. And again, India is the only game in town. You can manufacture in Vietnam, But Vietnam has 1/15 the population of China. You hit your capacity constraints almost immediately. Things are even worse in a place like the US, where, of course, you've got regulations and a labor force that's way overpriced and any number of problems. So that's why the subtitle is captured. Sometimes people have asked if it's in order to sell books. No, I mean, I legitimately don't know where Apple can go. Last thing, I'll say, I talked to a former senior vice president of Apple who, after reading the book, said, even if we knew Xi Jinping was coming and taking China in the direction that it took, where else would you have us go? And he's obviously just confirming my thesis, which is that, I mean, there really is no place else to go. So I think the common layperson understanding is that we're going to see more and more built up in India over the next few years. And I don't deny that we'll see more and more press releases stating as such, but I think actually the story is that multinationals operating in China are slowly being squeezed out in favor of Chinese companies, homegrown rivals that have learned from these multinationals. And so in a sense, even as you have diversification to India, you're actually getting more entrenched with Chinese companies, not less.
We're not going to see the divorce between China and Apple anytime soon. Remarrying with
I love
India.
the marriage thing. I do quote someone in the book saying the relationship Apple enjoys with China could blow up any day. And I think that's a clear risk. But I like to flip this on its head a little bit and say, the other risk is that this continues. Because this has worked really well for Apple and it's worked really well for China. I don't think it's worked very well for America's industrial base or Mexico's. There's a great paper called NAFTA's Uninvited Guest about how successful Mexico and US and Canada were from 1993, the signing of NAFTA, to 2001. And then once China enters the World Trade Organization, we talk about American jobs being lost to China. Mexican jobs were far more competitive with China and they got, throttled, I don't know, something like that. Unfortunately, I'm like this, gregarious golden retriever Canadian, and I'm really optimistic. And I've really written a pessimistic book, which is a strange thing to be associated with.
Would you be their divorce lawyer if it happened? Okay, let's open up to questions. If you have a question, please wait for the microphone to come to you and ask the question through the microphone, please. The microphone is in the back. Does anyone have a question here? Oh, so it's one in the front.
Hi. To what extent do you think Apple is involved in the internal migration of manufacturing capacity in China? It started in Shenzhen, but it gradually spread to Chengdu and Zhengzhou. Is that solely a Foxconn-driven decision, or does Apple also care about where the capacity is?
Yeah, so that was 2010. That's exclusively a Foxconn decision. I've got this great anecdote where the iPad and the iPhone 4 are about to come out, and Tim Cook and Terry Guo meet. And Tim Cook offers these sort of conservative estimates of how big these products are going to be. And Terry Guo, I think the quote is, "You're sandbagging me." I had to look that up. I'm not even sure exactly what it means now, but Terry's basically way optimistic about what the products are going to be globally, not just in China. And Tim Cook doesn't agree. And so Terry Guo sort of bets the company on the spot by saying, I'm going to build for you 2 new campuses, Chengdu, which becomes iPad City, and Zhengzhou, which becomes iPhone City. And if I'm right, I get all the orders for these products. So it's an instrumental move on behalf of Foxconn. And to some extent, it comes from Terry's bullishness on Apple. The other thing, though, is that he was reading the tea leaves of Beijing's 5-year plans. And what was going on in the financial crisis in 2008, right, is that you had this real overheating in the coastal cities of Shanghai and Shenzhen and so forth. And there was real inequality in China between these places. And so Terry Guo understood that his political interests, his business interests would be best if they were really aligned with what Beijing needed. And so that's why he wanted to make these massive investments, more than 1,000 miles from Shanghai, in these 2 major cities. This is before Apple's political awakening, before they really understand the country. So I would give all credit to Terry.
There's a question in the front.
Is that the green sweater?
The lady in the second row.
Hi, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Now, my question, I just want to preface it first because it may be outlandish. I did read about 4 years ago a book called 2035. Did you read that?
I have it on my shelf. It's like the fictional battle between Apple and...
No. 2035 is the global world order.
Yeah.
2035, and it was written by an American naval.
Yeah. They've done a sequel as well.
Yes, yeah. But in this book, they said the events they were doing it for 2060. The events were catching up with the two writers. They moved the date back to 2035 because everything was moving too close to what they thought was 60. Now, by 2035, China, they say this was a given. China invades Taiwan, takes over the chip industry. What would happen if China did that, but also, outlandish, turned around and said to Apple, we're nationalizing this product? What's, in a way down the road, what would hold China back?
It's a relatively simple question, but the answer is hilariously complicated. So I'm trying to, I don't know how much detail to go into. So first of all, just in case people aren't aware, TSMC is arguably the most important company on the planet. This is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. Every Apple product you've ever held over the last 14 years relies on TSMC products. So not just the iPhones, AirPods, everything. They produce something like 90% of all advanced chips in the world. And if you're not aware, I mean, chips run everything that you can think of, from your microwave to your car to your iPhone. So if for some reason TSMC is blockaded, right? Taiwan is blockaded, China annexes Taiwan or something. First of all, there's no iPhone. The only thing, I mean, the silver lining to this question is in that event, you're not going to care about where your next iPhone comes from, right? We're talking a world war scenario. I mean, I live in San Francisco, right? I'd be worried about San Francisco being bombed or something. I mean, that would be far more consequential than whether I get another iPhone. I wasn't meaning to be funny about that, but so it'd be the equivalent of a meteor strike on Apple's business if all of a sudden they can't produce chips out of Taiwan. There's no sort of second player to Taiwan. There is some capacity being built up in Arizona, but it pales in comparison to what they're able to achieve in Taiwan. So yeah, there's no real plan B. It's actually almost astonishing that we can talk about Apple's consolidation into China for the last half an hour without even mentioning Taiwan, because it's sort of a separate issue, and yet arguably they're even more consolidated because it's just a couple of different fabs that are manufacturing the chips there. I mean, for what it's worth, I love this quote. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times has said of TSMC, it is the only company in the world where, were it to stop producing, the entire world would fall into recession. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And then the other thing worth knowing is that not only are all CPU chips designed by Apple, fabricated by TSMC. The same is true for NVIDIA. So NVIDIA is the only company on the planet that outvalues Apple in terms of market cap, and it has the exact same geopolitical risk there. The third thing I'd point out is there are former military officials who have said that if China were able to somehow successfully invade Taiwan and take over the factories, American bombers would literally take them out, so that nobody had what TSMC was able to produce. They would rather have that than have them fall into the hands of just the Chinese. So that's a pretty major question. The book does go into some detail about it.
Let's hope the future doesn't look like that in 2035. Is there another question?
Yeah, I think you mentioned Made in China 2025. That was kind of a planned 10 years ago. Can you come, now it's 2025, I guess. So do you think that plan was successful 10 years later? What's your comments on that?
Yeah, so wildly successful. And I think Apple was the biggest contributor to Made in China 2025, which is quite the statement. I mean, when the plan first came out, this was like a big thing in Washington, right, where people were writing op-eds and concerned about everything China was doing. So to say that any Western corporation sort of played a role supporting it, I think would be a sort of contentious fact. And I'm saying that Apple was by far the biggest contributor to it. And the reason why is that once Tim Cook is able to convince Beijing, basically like, lay your hands off of us, you have no idea how much we're helping all your factories contribute. The sort of message, this is a private meeting, right? But it sort of trickles down across the Chinese supply chain. And so the thing that Terry Guo had figured out in 2019, it's not the profits, it's the learning. That gets known by the Chinese, who then began making bigger plays to be operating within Apple's supply chain, right? So the idea is that to be leaders of indigenous innovation, irony of ironies, the best way to do it is to go work with Apple, the mother of all capitalist companies. And so over the last 10 years, you've seen this pretty dramatic squeezing out of the Taiwanese companies in favor of what the Taiwanese call the red supply chain. So Luxshare is sort of the biggest among them. They're sometimes called mini Foxconn, but a homegrown rival. Goretech, Wingtech, and BYD, otherwise known as the maker of electric vehicles, is also in there. And that's just the assembly giants. It was sort of would have taken a lot more work, and I didn't have the time to sort of do that across the supply chain. But companies like Corning that famously make the glass for the iPhone, there's a bunch of Chinese competitors to do that Apple also works with. So you're sort of seeing this Chinification within Apple's supply chain, or the way I like to put it is like the real estate within the iPhone is becoming increasingly Chinese year in, year out. And so in that respect, Made in China 2025 has become stunningly successful.
I have a follow-up question to that. Do you think it's still true today to say that Apple is teaching its Chinese manufacturers or suppliers the most cutting-edge technology when it comes to making an electronic, like a phone? Or do you think the Chinese companies actually have caught up enough that they don't rely on Apple anymore?
Yeah, so I think in 2014 you had cheap mimicry on behalf of Xiaomi of Apple products. By 2018, 2019, I've got this great chapter all based on court discovery that no journalist had found before, but was made public about 2 years ago. And it's basically when Apple realizes that Huawei, Xiaomi, Oppo, Vivo are able to really outmaneuver Apple and basically come up with better products at a lower price than Apple's able to make. And that was 2019. 2024, 2025, I think they're absolutely making better products. I mean, they've definitely left the realm of we are imitating the West or we're making iPhone equivalents. The best example would be Huawei is now on the second edition of its trifold smartphone called the Mate XTS. In Apple terms, it's an iPhone and an iPad in one, so it unfolds twice. And when it's unfolded, it's thinner than the iPad Pro, which Apple has billed as the thinnest Apple product ever, and it costs $2,600. And some people have derided it for costing so much, and I think they're completely missing the point, right? The overall trajectory is that now it's a Chinese brand made in China that's coming out with the equivalent of a Ferrari in the smartphone world. I don't think anybody would have anticipated that 12 years ago.
Is there another question?
This is really fascinating. I find it totally entertaining. And now, going forward, it appears to me in this game of chess, I mean, China already has all the technology and know-how. And as you said, they have already passed the inflection point where they can generate so much better products. Therefore, I say to myself, now I'm going to throw another item into this soup, which is America's administration right now. And what is fascinating is, if to the extent you can visualize or see, how will this game play out? Meaning, now it's not just Apple and China, it is America and China, America vis-a-vis the rest of the world. America had been the top gun, so to speak, for the last 45 years since World War I. And now the tides of technology and education and invention and creativity and capital is flowing counterclockwise. So I know it's a huge question, but to the extent that you can answer it, I'll be most delighted to hear.
So the question is like, what's next kind of thing?
Yes.
What's going forward? I have to humbly answer that. I clearly don't know what's next. I'm just not all that optimistic in America's chances of sort of rebuilding our industrial capacity. I'm very supportive of it, to be clear. I've been at conferences where people are getting together wanting to do it. I'm all for it. But usually what you find is that they have inventions, right? They're thinking about it in what I deem such an American way, right? Like the sort of thing that gets you a Nobel Prize, where it's really creative. But what China's great at is scale. Right? Not 0 to 1, but 1 to 100. And we don't have many companies that think along those lines, right? I don't know any manufacturer that has 400,000 employees the way that Zhengzhou Foxconn has for every iPhone launch. And unless we have something like that, we're just never going to be competitive. So where I hold out some hope is Rush Doshi called this allied force in a Foreign Affairs article maybe 2 months ago, where, America versus China in terms of industrial capacity, we're not even close. But we have lots of allies. And if we can sort of have the industriousness of Mexico or the Western Hemisphere or India or like Alt-Asia, as The Economist has called it, then we can be a lot more competitive. So my sort of like big wish for Washington would be that instead of hoping that we have this America First policy where more and more is going to come to America, the policy should be to select certain industries, pharmaceuticals, high-end chips, high-end electronics, and be able to replicate those operations that China is so good at outside of China, almost irrespective of where that is, right? So right now, Donald Trump is actually against Tim Cook moving operations from China to India. I think that's a big win, right? If they can do it. Aside from what I said earlier about it only being the final assembly, like I want to see way more. But Washington needs to understand that it's a big win if those operations are being built in Mexico or India. But I think we often think of that as a problem because it's not American jobs. It's not American know-how. That's icing on the cake, but I don't think that's the main thing. So this is indirectly answering parts of your question, but probably not all of it. Yeah.
The path forward is very unclear. But as I see it, for example, like you have just said, if each aspect of the countries are contributing to a higher global GDP, then everybody wins. To the extent that we insist on the jobs coming back onshoring here, you have just mentioned very clearly, yeah, sure, that's wonderful and noble, but your labor costs is so darn astronomical expensive. I mean, you're not even competitive. And to the first very point you made, Apple has actually tried very best to go globally and also manufacture everywhere else, but it is China, and I think it's a cultural difference. I mean, you try to go to India and establish anything, the cultural difference is very different from the cultural mentality of a Chinese wanting to learn and execute and do and work long hours doing that. So these are all various differences. And it's all very well to say, bring the industry back. I wish we could.
Yeah, I agree with all that. We've also devalued manufacturing jobs. I mean, I would love to see the equivalent of Teach for America, which sort of had a mission to sort of re-up what the value of being a teacher was, right? So they would try to get people graduating from Princeton or Harvard or whatever and get them to be teachers for a few years, because manufacturing sort of looked down upon. And the more that it's looked down upon, the more we're not going to reinvigorate the manufacturing and it's going to go someplace else. And China really values manufacturing and it's paying dividends for them.
Build for America.
I'm sorry?
Build for America.
Build for America. Yeah, okay.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you so much for sharing the stories behind the scenes. So my question is whether you can talk more about the stories behind you writing the book, like the process itself, like how many people you have talked to, like how do you get the connection in Apple, like how long it takes, like all that sorts of stuff.
If I could add one more in there, were you able to go to China for this book to report?
I didn't go to China. When I pitched the book, I thought I would go to China, India, and Taiwan. But the book didn't play out at all the way I thought. So I reckoned I was going to give 4 or 5 months of going after as many people with Apple experience, whether they were current or they were former, as possible. But I'd been an Apple reporter for 4 years. It is not easy to get people within Apple to talk to you, right? I mean, someone once joked to me that they think they gave away their rights to their firstborn when they signed their contract with Apple. They've actually gotten problems with the Securities and Exchange Commission for how onerous their NDAs can be, et cetera. So I wasn't actually all that optimistic that I could tell the story through the lens of Apple. I thought that 4 or 5 months was going to fail, and then I was going to have to try to talk to Foxconn, Pegatron, Beal, Crystal, any number of companies in the supply chain. And by going to China to do that. Planning never failed. I ended up speaking to about 220 people, only counting the people with Apple experience. And I was honestly just drowning in information. I didn't know how to put it all together. And I remember a multi-month period where my biggest worry was getting a head injury, because the book was sort of in my head, but I hadn't actually written anything. I mean, I'd written notes, but I hadn't written like paragraphs, right? Like more than like bullet points, and like highlighted some things, and my notes were just a total mess. So I guess so there's sort of two things that happened. One, it just got to the stage where like I was just under the gun to meet a deadline, and I wasn't missing any information. And actually going to China wouldn't necessarily have solved any of the issues that I had, because short of having a time machine, I couldn't go back to the factories in the early 2000s that I really wanted to visit. So because I was telling a history, it didn't really matter what, Zhengzhou smells like, where you wanted to be a reporter and do like the real shoe leather reporting. That wasn't going to like actually help me. And then the other thing is that when I used to live in Hong Kong, I would go to China from one time and again. And, I would offer like a 20-day itinerary, and then they'd give me a 10-day visa because I'm a journalist and they don't love the idea. So I found myself in a situation where it was like, am I going to write a letter? Because I was going to have to say I was a journalist, right? I mean, I have an active Twitter and LinkedIn. I was just not going to mention that. So I could say I'm there as a tourist, like effectively lie about it, which seemed like a really bad idea. Or I could say what I was actually up to, which was like learn the secrets of Apple's China partnership. That seemed like a bad idea as well. And during the book page phase, Evan Gershkovich was imprisoned in Russia. And I've got 2 little daughters, and it just became like, I just don't think going to China is the right call for me right now.
So sorry, just to follow up on that. So the process is more like you talk to the 220 people first for a couple of months, and then write the book like in 2 months afterwards.
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but basically within a 12-month period, I spent 8 months just talking to as many people as possible, and then I spent 4 months living nocturnally and writing. I say I'm simplifying because, of course, in that 4 months, I continued to meet new sources. I was able to ambush some in person. Once found myself as the only non-Apple person in a 30-person room, like cocktail party. So like everyone was a potential source, and it was amazing. I could like recognize like LinkedIn faces that hadn't like responded to me, and then I would just go up to them and tell them that, and so that was great. And in the 8 months, I did do a little bit of writing. I just hadn't written like entire chapters or anything like that. I sort of had the contours of the book, but yeah, it's funny. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure if you're a journalist or anything, but I have no idea if there's any lessons on how to write a book based on how I wrote the book. Because I mean, it was just like at best organized chaos, and emphasis on chaos, not organized.
I do want to ask, did you get a sense that the Apple people really want to talk to you about their history?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So yeah, I mean, Apple's PR people aren't so happy with the book, but the people within Apple, I mean, certainly my sources are thrilled. But loads of people from within Apple have either reached out or I've met them at various speaking events. And they've all been really pleased with the book as well. I gather it's caused quite a stir, as you could perhaps imagine. But I mean, it's the first sort of attempt to look at how Apple worked in all these factories across Asia over a 25, 30-year period. And so a lot of people kind of feel seen by having their work sort of like, I don't know, what highlighted, I suppose, especially for how consequential it is. I mean, I really think it's strange how little we've placed on sort of how Apple actually makes its products, especially because they used to make all of their products, right? This was a company founded by 2 Steves in a garage in 1976. And until near bankruptcy in 1996, they built everything themselves. So that transition to offshoring and outsourcing, I think, is just like a phenomenal narrative. Like, I hope it do its justice, but just like on its own merits, it's certainly worthy of something. Maybe the last thing I should say, or I should give one funny anecdote. So I talked to one person who was in, let's just say, operations. And I had spoken to him, throughout for the writing of the book. And then I spoke to him a little bit after I'd sent him a copy, and he had received it. So we were speaking 2 months later. So I figured he had read the book. And he said, well, Patrick, I made the mistake of trying to read the book while I was on vacation. And the book was so accurate that it brought back trauma. Like, reliving Apple memories wasn't good for my vacation, so I had to put it down. And I maybe haven't given enough context for that. Like, there's so many divorces, marriages ending in the first 5 years of Steve Jobs coming back, that the company has to institute what engineers call the DAP, the Divorce Avoidance Program. And it's a series of measures to basically stop the attrition of engineers that they're losing because their marriages are on the line and they're having to quit Apple. And as sort of like devastating as that is, one person told me, never mind the divorces, you need to look at the deaths. And I was like, the deaths? So he starts telling me stories of people just dying on the Foxconn line or just having one too many trips and dying of exhaustion and stuff. And if that sounds a little hyperbolic or being anti-Apple, the person who most makes this argument is Steve Jobs, who attributed his getting cancer to 1997 when he was working as the CEO both of Pixar and Apple, and was coming home from the office so late that he couldn't like speak in English to his wife because he was so exhausted. And so Steve Jobs arguably died of overwork at Apple. So, you know, the narrative of how hard the Chinese worked is really well documented, really important, etc. But the narrative of these engineers who put in so many years of their life, just hour after hours, pleasing Steve Jobs' demand and stuff, is sort of not written about. But it's pretty well documented in the book.
Yeah, I think the DAP is one of my favorite notes from the book. I think that's all the time we have today. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but you can come to Patrick afterwards and ask him in private. So can we give a round of applause for Patrick?
Thank you.